This is a map of the smallest continent in the world that's home to one of the largest countries in the world. This diverse and vibrant terrain is also sometimes called Sahul, Australia New Guinea, Australinia, Maganesia, or Papaland in order to distinguish it from the country of Australia. Sahul originates from the name Sahul Shelf, which forms a part of the continental shelf of Australia, and the continent includes mainland Australia, Tasmania, the island of New Guinea, the Aru Islands, the Ashmore and Cartier Islands, most of the Coral Sea Islands, and some other offshore continental islands. With an area of 8.56 million square kilometers, the Australian continent is home to around 39 million people. Geographically, it's considered the flattest, lowest, and second most driest continent on the Earth. The only place drier than Australia is Antarctica. And did you know that Australia is the only continent on Earth without any active volcano? Most of the exotic flora and fauna of Australia isn't found anywhere else in the world. Over the years, many strange and bizarre things have been discovered in this island continent, from ancient relics to hieroglyphs to incredible fossils of creatures that roamed the planet millions of years ago. All sorts of unfathomable things have been found in Australia. And there are probably a whopping amount of secrets that scientists have still yet to unravel. Today, we're going to introduce you to some of the most terrifying discoveries from Australia that are making scientists wonder what else is out there. Number 1. Mungo Remains. Lake Mungo is the name that's given to a dry lake basin that includes multiple archaeological sites. One of the most thrilling ancient relics recovered from this region are the human skeletal remains belonging to the oldest known humans in Australia. Lake Mungo is one of the 5 major small dry lakes in the Willandra Lakes World Heritage Area, located in the southwest Murray-Darling Basin in western New South Wales. It's in the central portion of the system, and the deposit in which the archaeological sites lie is a transverse crescent-shaped dune deposit stretching across 30 kilometers. The age of deposition, however, varies throughout the area. 2 historic burials would be discovered in Lake Mungo in 1969 and 1974. Lake Mungo 1 is also called the Mungo Woman, and her remains were discovered by Jim Bowler, who was working with the University of Melbourne at the time. Carbon dating would reveal that LM1 was alive between 24,700 to 19,030 years ago. Her remains are poorly preserved, but the reconstruction and description of LM1 by Alan Thorne from the Australian National University would reveal that she was an early human inhabitant of the Australian continent, and her remains are by far one of the oldest sets of anatomically modern human remains found there. The site where she was found is considered the oldest known cremation site in the world. It also implies that many strange and complicated burial rituals existed in the early human societies. The bones of LM1 were repatriated to the traditional owners, an alliance named the 3 Traditional Tribal Groups, in 1992. She has become a symbol of the Aboriginal occupation of Australia and a valuable Indigenous archaeological icon. Lake Mungo 3, or the Mungo Man, was discovered by Jim Bowler in February of 1974 when shifting sand dunes exposed his remains. He would be found about 500 meters east of the LM1 site, and his body had been laid out on its back with the knees bent and hands positioned at the groin. The fingers were interlocked, and they also discovered the remains of a fire next to the body that had been sprinkled with red ochre. When LM3 would be discovered, most experts had believed that the Aboriginals had arrived in Australia from Asia around 20,000 years ago. But now, the discovery of LM3 and other archaeological finds in the region indicates that the human occupation of this continent could date back as far as 50,000 years ago. Paleontologists at ANU had estimated that LM3 was between 28,000 to 32,000 years old, but in 2003 it would be revealed by a multidisciplinary team of experts that the remains were actually around 40 years old. They also found out that LM1 was a similar age to LM3 and not 30,000 years old. In 1989, a skeleton belonging to a child would also be discovered there. The 3TTG blocked investigations of these new remains. On May 24th of 2022, the Mungo Lady and Mungo Man were then reburied. Number 2. Gosford Glyphs. The 300 Egyptian-style hieroglyphs located in Caerleon, New South Wales are also called the Caerleon hieroglyphs. They would be discovered in an area between Gosford and Woy Woy inside the Brisbane Water National Park, which is famous for its aboriginal petroglyphs. These unique carvings would first be reported by Alan Dash, a local surveyor who was working for the Gosford Council in 1975. Dash would keep visiting the site for the next 5 years and saw new glyphs whenever he took a visit. The site was engulfed with sand, rocks, and overgrown vegetation until David Lambert, a rock art conservator for the National Parks and Wildlife Service, came across some clear-cut hieroglyphs in 1983. These engravings depict a number of animals, which include chickens, dogs, and owls. There's also boats, stickmen, a dog's bone, and other things that lead to royalty having once been there. One of them is apparently Khufu, while the other one is uncertain. There's also a carving of the ancient Egyptian god Anubis. The site began getting more public attention during the mid-1990s, and since then, amateur Egyptologists and conspiracy theorists have claimed that these hieroglyphs are an authentic script that would be created around 4,500 years ago. They believe that the ancient Egyptians who sailed to Australia had engraved their story into the stones after they had become shipwrecked. The National Parks and Wildlife Service has denied these theories, and in a statement, a spokesperson would emphasize that the engravings are something they became aware of in the early 1980s, which is around the same time a majority of these were thought to have been created. Professor Boyo Okinga thinks that these glyphs may have been made by the Australian soldiers of the 1920s when the interest in ancient Egypt was considerably growing thanks to the unraveling of King Tutankhamun's tomb. Australian professor of Egyptology Nagub Kanawati has also stated that these are not authentic and were constructed in the early 1980s. Some people also think that some high school students had even copied these from their textbooks in the 70s, and a Yugoslavian immigrant had etched them into the 1980s because of his interest in Egyptology. Number 3. Gnomesville. Gnomesville is a town in Western Australia that has a population of around 7,500, but you won't find this place officially on any map. It also is not listed in the Australian Bureau of Statistics. The town is located out in the Australian bush just a few kilometers from Bunbury or Wellington Mills. The only industry that thrives in this town is tourism. The 7,500 residents of this strange town do not work, eat, sleep, or even drive automobiles. And in fact, all the citizens are inanimate gnomes that are made of artificial materials, which include wood, plastic, ceramic, metal, and any other thing that could be used to create a statue. No one truly knows how the place came to be in existence. One theory would suggest that a woman who liked repairing gnomes had left a few as a decoration, and people just continued to add to it. Another possibility is that the primary school children had complained that a nearby roundabout was a traffic hazard, and when the town council initiated a fix-up project, someone playfully added a gnome to stand guard. The workers brought the original home and others began to pitch in. Despite the disputed origin story, people had begun bringing more and more gnomes, and the collection simply grew. They became a distraction to drivers, so local authorities had to move them to a nearby area. By that time, the gnomes had also accumulated a lot of other goods, shelters, and toys, and these were also relocated with them as well. The gnome population has also included 2 football teams that are still standing, and with the changing season, they've been switched to cricket teams. There's all kinds of gnomes in the collection, which include partying gnomes, plane-flying gnomes, sitting gnomes, playing gnomes, and more. And this tiny town has become a popular tourist site thanks to the inhabitants and the exemplary work of volunteers, along with support from the Shire of Dardanup in the Ferguson Valley. You can also contribute a gnome to the community yourself, but it will need to have an identity. Number 4. Australia's oldest rock painting. A huge 2-meter-long painting of a kangaroo that was discovered in Australia's Kimberley region has been identified as the oldest intact rock painting in Australian history. The researchers who published their work in the journal Nature Human Behavior came across the images in the 1990s, but their age had been unknown because of the limitations of rock dating art. However, thanks to modern technological advancements, they were able to date the painting using quite an innovative method that relied on wasp nests. As these mud wasps have inhabited the caves for tens of thousands of years, the research team used radiocarbon dating to determine the age of 27 nests found below and above the paintings. These ancient nests contain charcoal from bushfires and fragments of animal and plant material. All of this contained carbon that could be dated and used to figure out a pretty specific range of dates when the kangaroo could have been produced. They found out that the painting is between 17,500 and 17,100 years old. According to Damien Finch, the pioneer of the new radiocarbon dating technique, this means it is the oldest known in situ paintings of Australia. The kangaroo is painted on the slope ceiling of a rock shelter on an estate that belongs to the Unhungo clan, located above the Drysdale River. Previously, researchers had looked at the stylistic features of the paintings and the order in which they were painted when they overlapped. Through this, they were able to work out that the oldest style of painting is what's known as the irregular infill animal, or the naturalistic period that features life-sized animals. The radiocarbon dating technique was used to map a total of 27 mud wasp nests underlying and 16 overlying different paintings from around 8 rock shelters. It would reveal that the paintings of this style were produced between 17,000 and 13,000 years ago. Dr. Sven Ousman from the University of Western Australia's School of Social Sciences thinks that the paintings will unlock further understanding of Indigenous cultural history. The iconic kangaroo image is visually quite similar to the rock paintings from islands in Southeast Asia that are more than 40,000 years old, suggesting a cultural link between the two regions and their inhabitants. Researchers are hoping to develop a timescale for Aboriginal rock art in the Kimberley region using wasp nests in order to establish more accurately when each art period began and ended. Number 5. Forest in a shipwreck. The Homebush Bay in Sydney became a natural wonder over the decades because of a peculiar abandoned half-sunken ship that's become a floating forest. The SS Airfield was a cargo ship that served to transport supplies to American troops in the Pacific Ocean during the Second World War. The ship would be brought to Homebush Bay in 1972 as it was supposed to be decommissioned and dismantled, but eventually the operations would cease and the ship was simply left to decay. Over the years, the wreck has been reclaimed by nature, and now it's overflowing with mangrove trees. The Homebush Bay is where many 20th century ships have ended up after they're no longer being put to use. The lush flora growing in the rusted hull of the SS Airfield is, however, the most impressive sight for the visitors. The 102-year-old ship weighs nearly 1,140 tons, and the locals have termed it the Floating Forest. Besides its history for shipbreaking and being a ghostly ship cemetery, Homebush Bay is also home to an Olympic stadium today. The abandoned ship that grew in a forest is a prime location for tourists and photographers who are fond of exploring and photographing old abandoned places. But why did nature choose to embrace this particular ship? Well, that's still the question that no one's been able to answer till this date. The stunning floating forest has also seen its fair share of hard times, but the rusted old vessel is now booming with a new life. Number 6. Kakuja. The discovery of this Aboriginal man's skeleton dates back to 2014 and has provided everyone with tantalizing glimpses into life and death in pre-colonial Australia. William Bates of New South Wales found the skeleton in a river in 2014. Because of his knowledge of the Aboriginal people, he was able to identify that the skeleton belonged to an Aboriginal male. The mouth of the skeleton was wide open, and Bates felt as though he were crying for help when he died. His bones showed visible signs of torture and violence. Initially, researchers would assume that he had been killed during one of the battles between British colonizers and the Indigenous people of Australia in the late 18th or early 19th century. However, they would be in for a huge surprise. The body is now called Kakuja, which means older brother. It would be examined by Dr. Michael Westaway, a paleoanthropologist at Griffith University in Queensland. From his analysis of the skeleton, Dr. Westaway would deduce that it was an important person when he was alive, and people cared for him. This assumption was supported by the burial in which his head was tenderly placed on a cushion of sand. At first glance, he thought that the lethal injury, a long wound on the body's skull, had come from a cutlass blade that was wielded by the British militia at the time, but it turns out that the man had died much earlier. Lab testing of the remains would reveal that he had been killed in the 13th century, and this was hundreds of years prior to when the Europeans arrived on the continent and introduced metal objects. Westaway thought that the big brother would be killed using a lil-lil, which is a sharpened club. However, he singled out one of the most iconic Aboriginal weapons as the reason behind his demise. The boomerang, a weapon with a long and incredibly sharp edge, was perhaps what had killed the man and was used to smash his head. The discovery of Kakuja's body provides a deeper insight into the intertribal violence in pre-contact Australia, which is still largely based on accounts instead of archaeological evidence. Number 7. Devil's Marbles. The Devil's Marbles are ancient granite boulders that seem to have dropped from the skies of the Barkly Tablelands. Karlu Karlu, or the Devil's Marbles Conservation Reserve, is actually a protected area in the Northern Territory of Australia in the locality of Warrumungu, almost 105 kilometers south of Tennant Creek. The nearest settlement is a small town located 9 kilometers to the south, and these boulders are of great cultural and spiritual significance to the Aboriginal traditional owners of the land. The reserve is also in protection of one of the oldest religious sites in the entire world, along with the natural rock formations that can be found here. Karlu Karlu is the Aboriginal word for both rock features and the surrounding area. It translates as round boulders, referring to the huge boulders that are found mostly in the western side of the reserve. The English name of these boulders comes from John Ross, who during an 1870 Australian Overland Telegraph Line expedition would state that this was the Devil's Country and that he had even emptied his bag of marbles all around the place. The ownership of the Devil's Marbles would officially be passed to the traditional owners at a ceremony that was held on the reserve in 2008. These marbles that formed over millions of years ago continue to crack and erode, thereby providing a unique view every time you visit. The huge granite boulders form the exposed top layer of an extensive and mostly underground granite formation. The peculiar shape of these boulders can be attributed to the natural process of weathering and erosion. Some of these are naturally yet precariously balanced atop one another, while others have been cleanly split down the middle by natural forces. These are the most widely recognized symbols of Australia's outback, and therefore see a huge number of visitors every single year. Number 8. New hairy crab species. A family in Australia came across a never-before-seen species of sponge crab recently. Scientists have confirmed that it is a terrifying new hairy crab species. These unique crabs use their claws to chop off sponges and hair scraped from other sea creatures. This feature functions as a camouflaging mechanism to help the crabs hide from dangerous predators, and there are around 40 species of these known from Australia, and nearly 40% of them are endemic. The new species, affectionately called L. beagle, would be spotted by a family along the beach close to the city of Denmark in Western Australia. The strange hairy creature had washed up on the shore, closely resembling other species of sponge crab that were found in that area. But there was one discerning trait that the other crab species did not possess. This crab was covered in hair that was much fluffier than usual. Andrew Hosey, a curator from the Western Australian Museum, stated that the extreme fluffiness was the main giveaway for the museum. He also observed that sponge crabs are often hairy, but their hair is mostly like velvet or felt. The hair of this new crab species had a pretty shaggy and very fluffy texture, and after closely studying the hairy crab, Hosey reached out to Colin McClay, a renowned retired marine biologist who has studied sponge crabs for decades. He also confirmed that the specimen was in fact a new species of sponge crab, and it was named after the HMS Beagle, a vessel that brought Charles Darwin to Australia back in 1836. Now, L. beagle may look frightening, but it really isn't something to be afraid of. In fact, scientists believe that the crab uses its hair and sponge-like hair only to protect itself and hide from its adversaries. They had compared the new specimen to other sponge crabs at the museum. Hosey and McClay have realized that there are at least 4 additional specimens within the El Beagle that had not been identified up until now. These strange crabs use their back legs to hold the trimmings gathered from sponges and other sea creatures with the help of their sharp claws. However, with time, the shell accumulates to cover their entire body and creates a hat-like structure. Experts are pretty excited about this discovery, and they think that it's a reminder that there's still a lot left to discover on the continent. Number 9. Longest fence in the world. Also called the dingo fence or dog fence, it's a pest exclusion fence that was built in Australia during the 1880s. Pest exclusion fences were built in Australia during the early days in order to protect small plots or cropland from the marsupial predators. In the 1860s and 70s, rabbit populations would begin rising rapidly across southern Australia. Similarly, the increasing dingo population was also becoming quite a problem for the locals, so a dingo-proof barrier became the need of the time. Government funding was used to heighten and expand this fence. The dingo fence was meant to keep the dogs out of the relatively fertile southeast part of the continent. They had been largely exterminated from this land previously, and people could not afford their return. The fence was vital in keeping the sheep flocks of southern Queensland safe from the dogs. It's one of the longest structures in the entire world, stretching a whopping 5,614 kilometers from Jimbour on the Darling Downs, nearby Dalby, through thousands of kilometers of the arid land. It comes to an end just a little west of the Eyre Peninsula on the cliffs of the Nullarbor Plain above the Great Australian Bight near Nundroo. Before 1948, the idea of a dingo barrier fence scheme had not come into fruition as a statewide project, as it would require annual maintenance and repair. The dingo fence has been somewhat successful, but the dingoes can still be found in parts of the southern states. In 2009, the fence was announced as one of the Q150 icons of Queensland for serving as an iconic innovation and invention. This fence has greatly reduced the loss of sheep to predators, and the exclusion of dingoes has allowed for increased pasture competition from rabbits, kangaroos, and emus. The sheep are still being lost to the increasing numbers of feral dogs, though. The 2,500-kilometer section of the fence in Queensland is also called the Great Barrier Fence, or the Wild Dog Barrier Fence 11. It's administered by the Department of Agriculture and Fisheries, and the staff looking after it consists of 23 employees, which includes 2-person teams that patrol a 300 kilometers long section of the fence on a weekly basis. The fence also passes the point where the 3 states of Queensland, New South Wales, and South Australia meet. Number 10. Pterosaur. Scientists have discovered 2 new ancient flying reptiles recently. These remains were excavated from the baked red clay of outback Queensland. Experts have found out that these bones belong to pterosaurs. The bone scarring would suggest that one of the pterosaurs may have actually been snapped at by a crocodile. These are some of the earliest vertebrates known to evolve powered flight. The discovery was announced by the Australian Age of Dinosaurs Museum and Melbourne Museum, and the fossilized pterosaur bones would be recovered at cattle stations that were about 355 kilometers apart. Scientists believe that they date back to the early to mid-Cretaceous period, almost 145 million years ago. The first bone was a partial femur and would be discovered in 1991 during a field expedition. The second partial femur would be found more than a decade later around Winton. Remains from these ancient flying reptiles are quite rare in the Australian continent. To date, only 4 of these species have ever been identified in Australia. A previously discovered species is the largest known flying reptile that's found in Australia, having a wingspan of around 7 meters. Researchers are super excited by these new findings because they can provide invaluable evidence into how the ancient reptiles interacted with each other millions of years ago. According to Swinburne University PhD student Adele Pentland, the presence of 2 circular depressions on the pterosaur's femur indicate that it was probably bitten by a small crocodile. These pterosaurs are very similar to each other, as well as other fossils that are found in Brazil. Experts believe that during that period, these creatures were spread on almost every continent. Number 11. Lake Hillier. This is a small surreal lake that's located on an island called Middle Island in Australia, and it is hands down one of the most mesmerizing natural features of the continent. Middle Island is the largest island in the archipelago off the coast of Esperance. The peculiar saltwater lake is around 600 meters wide, having no affluents. It's also surrounded by sand and dense vegetation on all sides. The eucalyptus trees are particularly abundant in this area. But why is the lake actually so popular? Well, it's because of the mesmerizing pink water within the lake, which is a striking contrast to the intense blue of the ocean. The two waters are separated by just a thin strip of earth that's covered with a popular Australian plant. The pink color of the beautiful lake is permanent and does not change even when the lake water is taken into a container. Most experts believe that this color is induced by the presence of an organism called Dunalilia salina, and metagenomic analysis on the lake would be performed by the Extreme Microbiome Project to find that this element, as well as another one, and a few species of others were present. And all of these combined together are what makes the water pink. Lake Hillier would first be visited by the Matthew Flinders expedition in 1802. The journal entries by Flinders are considered to be the first written record of this stunning pink lake. Scientists have hypothesized that when the lake waters reach high salinity, high temperatures and sunlight combine to make the algae release a pigment that colors the lake water pink. It's also thought that some other microorganisms inhabiting the salt crust on the lake surface may also contribute to the pigmentation. Because of its color, the lake is often referred to as Lake Rose. Despite the high salt content, Lake Hillier is safe for swimming, but it's not advisable or even allowed. In order to swim in this lake, you're going to need to get prior approval by the Western Australia Department of Environmental Conservation. And as of 2012, the lake has been relocated within the boundaries of an archipelago nature reserve. Would you like to take a swim in the lake? Tell us all about it in the comments down below.